What I want to do is have you focus on this question. We know there's a big gap between where we are in quality and safety and where we want to be. But what does it look like on the other side of that chasm if we were to get where we want to be? Because if we can't characterize that, then it'll be hard to know whether we're making progress toward getting there. And so think about that as we go through the first part of this talk, and then we'll have a specific discussion about what that looks like. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Joint Commission, just maybe 2 minutes. The Joint Commission has a number of different component parts. John's mentioned the newest part, the Center for Transforming Healthcare, which I'll talk about at some length. The Joint Commission International is part of the Joint Commission. And together, we have a lot of accreditation and what we also call certification that I'll mention in a second. We now accredit about 500 hospitals in 50 countries around the world, and a lot more than that domestically in the US. But fundamentally, the Joint Commission over the last 60 plus years has been built on 3 core strengths. And they have evolved, as John so wonderfully described this morning, from the history of the Joint Commission with the American College of Surgeons' first program to enunciate some standards for quality in hospitals, and then actually go out and see whether those standards were being met. So the first one is to create and continuously update evidence-based standards for quality and safety. So what do you have to do as a hospital, as an ambulatory care organization, as a hospice, as a laboratory, a nursing home, in order to provide the safest, highest quality care? And that requires continual attention to the science and to how everything in practice is changing. The second component, which is less well understood, but I think equally important, is once we have the standards, the measures, the other requirements, how do we figure out if an organization is actually meeting those standards? And we have developed over the years and continued to improve upon the best methods as we have developed them, and the Joint Commission, long before I got there, took the next leap into the improvement of this component of accreditation by saying, we can't just sit in a conference room or a boardroom and look at big 3-ring binders of policies and procedures and hear stories from the organization staff about how great they are. We need to get out into the patient care areas through what you're familiar with, the tracer methodology, which really does focus on how all of those clinical care processes, the structure, the process, the strategies that John O'Brien talked about, how all of that impacts on the patient through the tracer methodology. So that's an example of one of the ways we have innovated in trying to keep constantly before us the question of how do we make sure that the organizations we work with actually meet those standards. And then third is creating and again maintaining, because the science changes all the time, measurement systems that we can use, and in the United States it's now been deployed for a decade, literally a decade, where hospitals collect exactly the same data on now about 15 different measure sets and 45 different measures, and report to us on a continuous basis. We have a whole range of systems to make sure the data are identical, collected identically, audited so that the data quality is very high, so that we can compare and contrast how hospitals are doing on those measures. And one of the papers you have in your folder is an examination of the difference between Joint Commission accredited hospitals and non-Joint Commission accredited hospitals on these measures. And I won't give away the conclusion, but you may be able to guess it by the fact that the paper's in your booklet. Joint Commission accredited hospitals did a lot better. Now, in recent years, we've built on this foundation of accreditation, standards, survey methods, and measurement, a completely new function for the Joint Commission, which is the creation of interventions to improve, to solve safety and quality problems, so that we are now an improvement organization in addition to being an accreditor. And you'll have copies on all these slides. They'll be emailed out. I didn't quite have them ready to be included on the memory stick, but you'll have them. So that's another part of what the Joint Commission does that is a benefit to accredited organizations. And since we are a not-for-profit company in the US and around the world, we also make a lot of this information public, but tools and methods that we have created in recent years that are provided to accredited organizations as part of accreditation are directed at this new part of the mission to help organizations improve. And now, by the middle of this year, we were just a hair's breadth under 20,000 accredited and certified customers in the US across all of these different parts of the delivery system. And one of the issues that we have that I'm hearing is not entirely dissimilar to Ireland is that we accredit the way healthcare is delivered in the United States in silos, very fragmented. And one of our biggest initiatives now, which you can actually see on the Joint Commission website, is an emphasis on transitions of care, improving transitions of care when patients move from one setting to another. And even within the hospital, for example, moving from the emergency department to an inpatient floor, or from an ICU to a post-surgical recovery floor, those transitions are fraught with opportunities for error. And when we look at the outcomes that are generated when those transitions don't go well, they are uniformly bad. So you'll see on the Joint Commission website a transitions portal that coalesces a lot of information about how to improve transitions. And I emphasize that just to also show you the numbers here that, and my Director of Business Development is searching for the 20,000th customer, and I am assured we will have a little party as soon as that customer is identified. And we've been growing very rapidly over the last several years in the US. We've added more than 1,000 net new customers each year, so it's a rapidly expanding set of work for us. Now, so let's switch back for a second to the side of the chasm that we are presently on. You are, because you are on the front lines of care or very close to the front lines of care, a little bit closer than I am now, you know what the problems are as well as I do. And I'm going to illustrate some of those that make headlines. This is one that made headlines a little while ago in the US. The Tulane Medical Center had to notify 360 patients because they discovered that their endoscope reprocessing sterilization methods were faulty, and those patients had been exposed potentially to hepatitis B, hepatitis C, or HIV. 360 patients. This is Tulane, but it literally could have been one of a couple dozen organizations that have had exactly the same problem with actually exactly the same equipment. Endoscopic equipment is a particular problem to get the sterilization and sanitization procedures right. This is the story of a patient who a couple of years ago went into a hospital, a very well-known hospital in Minnesota, with a cancer in one kidney, but they took the healthy kidney out instead of taking out the kidney with the cancer. And I did find this case from Dublin, where a child of 12 years old had the wrong kidney removed a few years ago. These are global problems. Here's one from the UK from just a few months ago, where the surgeon who was operating on a diseased kidney was told by a medical student in the operating theater, "Doctor, you're operating on the wrong kidney." But he proceeded to take the healthy kidney out, and this patient died about 5 weeks later. And we still set fire to patients in our operating rooms. Now, those of you in the front might actually see that there's a flame here in this picture. This is not an American audience, but an American audience would recognize the New York Post as one of the worst tabloids in the US. So a generic picture of an operating room wasn't theatrical enough for them. So in the fine print in the bottom of this article, there's a reference to the fact that the photo is a reenactment. So I think it's fair to say that even after more than a decade of intense focus by healthcare organizations, especially hospitals around the world, on safety and quality, that if I were to characterize the state of quality very briefly, that we would have to say we still see routine safety processes failing routinely. Whether it's washing our hands, medication administration, all of the routine processes that we do hundreds, if not thousands of times a day. And they don't fail 5 or 10% of the time. They fail 20, 30, 40, 50% of the time. The closer you look, the more failures that you see. And we also have this seeming never-ending stream of uncommon, thankfully, but catastrophic and completely preventable adverse events. How do we operate on the wrong patient or the wrong side of a patient's body in 2012? We still have too many retained foreign objects after surgery. Infant abductions, and you know these as well as I do. Most of these were first discovered as major quality problems by the Joint Commission with its adverse event reporting program called the Sentinel Event Program, but we still have them. And we have them in such large amounts that it's hard to understand. And in fact, with these events, they are impossible to explain to patients and families. They are completely inexplicable when they occur. So I want to challenge you with a question that I will start to answer, perhaps, in the middle of the talk, which is, why after a decade of intense work all around the world, because these problems are global, why do we still have problems in safety and quality of that magnitude? Now, you know as well as I, and I've been learning a lot of wonderful information about the Irish healthcare system. There are as many healthcare systems as there are developed countries. The diversity in financing, organizing, structure, the balance between public and private, huge diversity in the way in which healthcare is delivered, but we all have the same quality and safety problems. It's really remarkable, and I just illustrated that with a couple of those headlines. No system has figured out how to solve these problems, which is another clue to what's on the other side of the quality chasm. The failures are common, and we believe, and I've believed now for quite some time, that if we're going to really see what the other side of that chasm looks like, we have to look outside healthcare. And we've spent a lot of time over the last 4 or 5 years at the Joint Commission doing that. And if you do that, you find a whole range of examples. And in this literature, they're called high reliability organizations. And don't get confused by that phrase. That just means organizations that perform at a consistently high level of excellence. Very high levels of safety maintained over long periods of time. That's all that means. And the usual suspects are there. We've heard a lot of talk about air travel and nuclear power. But when you look broadly at this literature, you find other very interesting examples. Amusement park safety, those wacky roller coasters that spin around and around, wildland firefighting crews, aircraft carrier flight deck operations. There are many of these organizations that have the same things in common with each other. And basically, they have 3 things in common. They are, first of all, fanatically devoted to safety. That is priority 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They have incredibly effective process improvement tools to create nearly perfect processes, and then a culture of safety that wraps around those highly performing processes and maintains them over long periods of time. Now, I know there's a lot of quality improvement experience in the room, and I know I had this experience when I was on the side of a hospital trying to do quality improvement. When you put a lot of effort into trying to solve a problem with your best people, you get some traction on it, you measure improvement, but then that team needs to move on to another problem. And if you ever look back at the problem you solved last year, what happens to it too often? starts to go back to the way it was before. You lose a lot of that initial improvement, and that's very demoralizing. These organizations have solved that problem. And they've solved it largely by a very different mechanism than we use in healthcare. The way they stay safe is that everyone who comes to work every day is looking at every process that she or he touches, every process with an eye toward, is there something different today that means this process isn't working as well as it should? Something very small, maybe. A little shortcut around a safety protocol because that protocol wasn't quite adapted to the situation I'm seeing right now. A mistake that somebody made last night because of a distraction, or an equipment maintenance protocol isn't quite being followed perfectly. When they discover problems at that level of evolution, they're very small and they're easy to fix. And when you discover them so far upstream from harm, before they pose any great risk, then you start maintaining levels of safety because nobody got hurt. The process didn't blow up. Now, when you think about how we do it in healthcare, it's very different, right? I mean, we're almost always looking at an incident that hurt a patient, trying to figure out why that happened, and then figuring out what we can do to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's not how these organizations stay safe. Now, one of the fellows that's written a lot about this, his name is Carl Weick, W-E-I-C-K. How many of you have read high reliability stuff? Has that gotten, that's about what I usually get when we talk about this? Carlo, thank you. Okay.
I had to.
Carl Weick has said, what characterizes what it feels like inside these organizations is an atmosphere of collective mindfulness. You know, being a physician, that sounds an awful lot like chronic anxiety to me. And that's not too far off the mark. But let me ask you to do a thought experiment. And I've done this around the world. So, but I'm not going to embarrass you by asking you to raise your hands, which I've also done around the world. Think about, now how many of you work in hospitals? Lots of hospital folks. Okay. Think about the place in your hospital that does the decontamination, cleaning, sterilization of instruments for surgery. And think about the tech that that department just hired a month ago. Trained him up, he's in there doing his work. And at the busiest time in the morning, the first wave of instruments is coming back from the first set of cases. Very high volume time. That tech sees that something is not right with the decontamination protocol. The instruments are not being cleaned properly. Now, how many of you, think to yourself, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, I said I wouldn't do that. How many of you are certain that that person in your hospital would do the right thing and report immediately to his supervisor, there's a problem with the decontamination protocol? Question one. Question two, how many of you are certain that that supervisor would do the right thing and stop the decontamination sterilization procedures, recall all the instruments that had been processed with the faulty decontamination protocol so they could be sterilized properly? How many of you are certain that would happen in your hospital? Now, when I ask that question around the world and in the United States, the hands that go up when I ask people to raise their hands, I'm not going to do that. What's your guess at the percentage of folks that raise their hands when I ask that question? It's pretty consistent. It's less than 5%. Now, if we had to measure the chasm, the difference between that 5%, and if I asked that question in a room of aircraft carrier flight maintainers, there wouldn't be a single hand that was held in a lap. If I asked that question at a meeting of amusement park equipment maintainers, there wouldn't be a single hand that remained in a lap. All of the hands would go up because their very livelihood and their professional consideration of their own, the way they do their own work, depends on identifying the small things when they're easy to fix. So the science tells us a little bit about how these organizations look inside and how they function inside themselves, but we know there aren't any healthcare organizations that are that safe today. So it's interesting that there really is no guidance in this literature on how you move from where healthcare is, which is pretty low reliability, and I'll show you some numbers in a little bit, how you get from low to high reliability. So we've spent a lot of time in the last few years at the Joint Commission assimilating this science with expertise from around the world and from many other industries and our own voluminous experience with where healthcare is to try to answer this question. How do we create some guidance to help healthcare organizations with this roadmap, blueprint, tools, strategies to get to high reliability, consistent excellence? What we find even in the best organizations with the most name recognition and the best reputation is, and they will be the first to agree, unless they're on a survey, what we find is there are pockets of excellence. There's excellence in the high-risk neonatal service. There's a pocket of excellence in the interventional cardiology service, but not so much in the GI surgery service, and not so much in the orthopedic service. We have not been able to find an organization with consistent excellence across everything that they do, maintained over time. So we have taken a shot at describing what a pathway might look like. So if high reliability is up there somewhere, and healthcare is down there somewhere, and the gap is that difference between the 5% and 100%, we have put a stake in the ground and said healthcare has to undergo 3 major changes. The first is a leadership commitment to zero. 0 major quality failures. And by leadership, we mean actually what's in our accreditation standards. It's the governing body, the management, physician leadership, nurse leadership, all of the components of leadership have to be aligned around this ultimate goal. This is not going to be accomplished tomorrow. But if we don't establish it as the ultimate goal, as the destination, then we're not going to know how close we are to getting there. So the quality chasm on the other side starts to look like high reliability, consistent excellence, 0 major quality failures. And then emulating high reliability organizations, but adapting to healthcare, we need a fully functional safety culture. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that in a few minutes. Combined with these very effective process improvement tools. We're calling them RPI, Robust Process Improvement. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Now, tying all this stuff together, if you want to read one person, I would suggest you read Jaymes Reason. He's the cognitive psychologist from the UK who is, in my opinion, the leading world's expert on why bad things happen in big organizations. And he's described, and I'm translating only a little bit, he's described how these pieces fit together in very safe organizations this way. So in order for that tech in the sterile processing department to immediately report the smallest deviation, that tech needs to trust his coworkers because somebody's making mistakes in there. And if he doesn't know that his coworkers won't treat him like a traitor and a snitch and a rat, he's not going to tell you in management anything. So that's the first component of trust. The second is he has to trust management. He's got to trust his supervisor will do the right thing. If he's going to expose himself, the supervisor has to do the right thing to call the problem to management's attention, and then management has to fix the problem using these very highly effective process improvement tools, and then communicate that improvement back to the people who brought it to their attention in the first place, so their trust in each other and in management is reinforced. You start doing that, you get more reports that are further upstream from harm when they're even easier to fix. And if you start communicating that back, you get more trust, more reports. But you have to do all of those elements, and then you get a very positively reinforcing culture. This is at the heart of a high reliability organization and how they stay safe. Now, this is on the Joint Commission website. It is an article that Jared Loeb of the Joint Commission and I wrote last year for Health Affairs that lays this out in a little more detail, and you can take a look at it if you like. It turned out, much to our surprise, to be the third most widely read article in the journal for the entire year of 2011. So this is starting to get a little bit of attention. But basically, this is how we are conceiving of what the other side of the chasm looks like. Now, we have a lot of initiatives. So part of our migration from accreditation to accreditation plus improvement is in our high reliability initiatives. And you can find a high reliability resource center on the Joint Commission website. Just go to jointcommission.org and look for topics, and there's a whole bunch of stuff about high reliability, what we're doing, what others are doing. We have created now, we're in the process of finishing a self-assessment tool. We've broken down the 3 components of the change into 14 subcomponents. So leadership has 6, safety culture has 5, robust process improvement has 3, and this is a little self-assessment for leadership to assess where they are in each of these 14 components over 4 different stages of maturity, from the very beginning of this journey to high reliability to getting much closer. And we are undertaking, after the first of the year, a statewide initiative, this will be in South Carolina actually, with a group of hospitals who will look intensively, using this tool as a start, at where they are themselves. So are your physicians engaged? How many of your physicians are engaged? Do you have all the elements of a safety culture? I'll talk more about that. So they can discover common barriers and test and evaluate solutions, this is an attempt to move an entire organization, not just a measure and not just one process, but move an entire organization closer to high reliability. And as I said, you can follow the progress on this resource center. So let me spend a couple of minutes talking about the relationships of safety culture to improvement and to high reliability. In my view, this is probably the most difficult set of challenges that face us as healthcare organizations trying to get a lot better. So I said trust is really important because small things need to be reported. And you can only do that if you don't blame and punish folks for reporting small things that are going wrong. So in the US, this has been interpreted by some as meaning that, well, we need to move away from blame and punish to blame-free. And how many of you know that phrase, blame-free culture? Yeah, you've heard that, right? Well, I can tell you that there is no high reliability organization on the planet that has a completely blame-free culture. None. 0. It's much more difficult than that. A true safe culture balances learning from the small errors that people make because we're human, balances that learning with accountability for adherence to safe practices. So once you've fixed a process and you've made the right thing the easy thing to do, the serial violators who don't wash their hands, who throw things in the operating room, who don't adhere to the safe practices in medication administration, who reuse multi-dose, all of those things, those people need to be subjected to discipline. So the critical part of the trust component of a safety culture is that these organizations have clear and transparent rules for how we triage and decide what is a blameless error that we're going to set aside and use for learning, what's blameless, and how do we distinguish that from the blameworthy. That means assessing errors and patterns of errors uniformly, with taking into account the level of skill and all the rest of that, but uniformly across all different caregiving groups, and having one code of behavior to get rid of the kind of behaviors that undermine a culture of safety. It is separating the blameless from the blameworthy that is the critically important and probably most difficult part of this trust component of safety culture. Now, we've written about this, and if you don't know about the Joint Commission's Sentinel Event alerts, they're available to everyone on our public website. Again, go to jointcommission.org, topics, Sentinel Events. And this is the way we have disseminated common learnings from our own experience with over 10,000 of these very nasty adverse events that we have helped customers walk through in their assessment and their root cause analysis, their corrective action planning. This is one of them. This is number 40 from 4 years ago. And this is a description of what kinds of behaviors undermine a culture of safety and erode trust. So there's a very wide range, it turns out, from simple impatience all the way to physical abuse. The caricature, right, is the surgeon who has a tantrum and throws scalpels in the operating room. Now, fortunately, that is much less common in the US. I haven't been in Irish ORs. Much less common than it was 15, 20 years ago. But if you ask the question, what is the most common kind of intimidating behavior? The answer is something that you might not expect. If you ask caregivers, what kinds of behaviors, when they are exposed to them, do they experience as intimidating? It's refusal to answer questions. It's impatience, condescending tone. That's the stupidest question I've heard this morning. Just give the drug the way I ordered it. And it is amazing how common this is. In fact, in the survey that's on the Institute for Safe Medication Practices website, references in our Sentinel Event Alert, about a quarter of the nurses and physicians who responded to that survey in the US said they had experienced these behaviors themselves personally from physicians more than 10 times in the past year. It doesn't take too many of those interactions to suppress reports. That order looks a little funny. Well, that doctor yelled at me the last time I said this looked a little funny. I'm not going to bring it to his attention again. Now, the media in the US immediately misrepresented this as focused only on physicians. It is not a problem only of physicians. Nurses do this to other nurses. Pharmacists do this to other pharmacists. Senior physicians do it to junior physicians. So it is a very common set of problems. So that's on the one kind of how do we separate blameless from blameworthy. Blameworthy is intimidating behavior. Blameworthy is also not having accountability for safe practices. Because in addition to tolerating this intimidating behavior, we also have a very long track record of not applying disciplinary procedures uniformly to all classes of caregivers, right? And we still have that problem. That lack of uniformity also erodes trust. When one group seeing another group engage in behaviors and make mistakes that they know they'd be fired for on the spot, also erodes trust and leads to the suppression of the reports that you need to get if you're going to fix your processes. And the belief in a completely blame-free culture sort of excuses accountability, which is antithetical to high reliability. So striking the balance is what's critical. Learning from blameless errors and holding everybody accountable for adherence to safe practices. That is the complexity inside the trust component of a safety culture. Let me try out on a real case at the risk of going over time. This is a real case that I was connected with some years ago. This was an elderly woman who presented in the evening to the emergency department with a lot of problems, and she was admitted. One of the admitting orders was for phenytoin for 300 milligrams 3 times a day. Yes, I used an unapproved abbreviation there, I'm sorry. So I used the right name here, phenytoin, Dilantin, brand name, yeah, anti-seizure drug. Huge dose for an elderly person, right? But the resident that wrote that order consulted one of this hospital's defenses, an electronic data repository. And he looked in that data repository for information on what this woman's medications were, and that was the order in the EDR. He didn't recognize that it was a problem. He consulted a defense, but he made a mistake because he didn't bring this to anybody else's attention at the time he wrote the order. So think about that mistake. Now the pharmacist, when that order went into the system, even though it was a fully computer order entry-ized hospital, a pharmacist reviewed every order, another good defense the hospital had. He reviewed that order and found the error and said, I think this is too much, and he told the nurse and the physician who were on, now it's after midnight or it's close to midnight, told them he thought it was going to be a problem and dispensed only 1 dose to the floor. Unit dosing, another defense that this hospital had. But there was a handoff failure. These folks went off shift and didn't communicate the problem to the oncoming shift the next morning. Another failure. The nurse who came on duty in the morning saw the order, but no dispensed medication because it had been given the night before. So what do you think she did? She went to see her patient. Patient was a little confused, 86-year-old woman, early in the morning. And she thought, well, you know, those phenytoin capsules, they're giant horse pills, that she might have some trouble swallowing it. So she used another patient's phenytoin, which happened to be issued from the pharmacy in suspension form, which was a weakness in the unit dose defense because unit dosing was only for pills and not for liquid. And I'll shorten this. This went on for several days. She got very phenytoin toxic until it finally dawned on folks that what was wrong here was a series of errors. Now, think about this from the framework, accountability framework that I laid out for you. How would you separate blameless from blameworthy among all of these errors? Let's just focus on one. How about the nurse who used another patient's phenytoin? Now, in every hospital I'm familiar with in the US, there is a protocol that says you never do that, right? And you have protocols like that too? Is that enough to say we ought to send this nurse to a disciplinary process? Well, suppose the protocol that prohibits this is in a dusty 3-ring binder on somebody's desk, and it's not well communicated to everybody, and this nurse knows that a lot of other people were doing the same thing because the pharmacy was late with the dosing and da-da-da. So if the protocol, the process that we want to happen is routinely violated, is it fair to blame this individual because she did what others have done in that situation? Not so much. So there actually is a fairly straightforward set of questions that you would ask in this situation to get some answers to the question about, is this blameless or blameworthy? It is often not simple or straightforward, but that does not mean we should avoid tackling it. So that's a very quick tour through safety culture. Now let me talk a bit about RPI. What we mean by RPI is actually pretty simple. It's a bunch of tools that have come out of industry in the last 15 years or so. Lean, Six Sigma, formal approaches to change management. I couldn't agree more with John from Mount Carmel that change management is essential to improvement. We have fully adopted these tools, and we are using them to transform our culture, to become an improvement organization, to improve our business. And we're also adopting all the components of safety culture, and we are measuring how well we're doing on all of that and reporting those metrics to our board as part of the board's assessment of how well we're managing our organization. We're doing that to improve our business, but also because we didn't want to be accused of just talking the talk when we said to the delivery system, we want to use these tools together with you to generate really better, much better improvement, much better interventions. And this is actually from the American Society for Quality's newsletter, a journal, Quality Progress, about how we were deploying the tools of RPI. Those are far more effective than what came out of industry in the last generation, CQI, TQM, quality circles, all of that. I started a program like this when I was at Mount Sinai before coming to the Joint Commission in 1999, became convinced by seeing how effective they are in solving some of the safety and quality problems that we have been talking about that have resisted us so far. So we have created a new part of the Joint Commission called the Center for Transforming Healthcare, because that's where we're using these tools together with a whole variety of healthcare systems and hospitals that have also mastered the tools of RPI to solve some of these really nasty safety and quality problems. I want to spend the rest of the time talking about what we've found. We're delivering the products of the center at no added cost to accredited customers, and I'll talk about their availability internationally in a moment, in large part because a lot of these far-sighted companies, that AHAs, the American Hospital Association, Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, and then the big healthcare companies have donated money to the endowment of this center, each of these more than $1 million. We're up around 35 million, getting to be a substantial endowment. And this is the roster of problems that the center has tackled since its first full year of operation in 2009. And I'll come back and show you some numbers here in a second. This is the list of now 27 hospitals and systems in the US that are participating with us because they have mastered the tools of Lean and Six Sigma and change management. And you'll see some of the, what you might call usual suspects here, the folks with great reputations, but you don't have to be a Mayo. You can be a Wentworth Douglas, 187-bed community hospital, and invest in these tools. And I would argue, and I'm not going to have a lot of time to get into this, happy to do that in the question period, I would argue that in situations of scarce resources, you need these tools much more than you do than when you are awash in cash. These are the tools that can show you where the waste is, where the wasted steps are in processes. You can reclaim 25% of your nurses' time by cutting wasted steps out of their daily processes. You can improve your financial performance by cutting the waste out of your billing and cost reimbursement systems. However you get paid, you can use these tools to generate a 3 or 4 to 1 return while you're learning how to deploy them on the safety and quality problems that are so vexing. So I said these are the problems, and if you've been thinking at all about that second question I asked, which is, why do we still have these problems if we've been focused so much resources in the last 10 years on getting rid of them? Well, I think you have to ask, well, how have we been trying to influence them? And I think it's fair to say we really have been using variations on pretty much a single theme. We find somebody that's done a really good job in managing anticoagulation safety. And we say, oh my God, that's a best practice. We make toolkits, checklists, bundles, protocols, and we say, everybody else, do it exactly the same way, and you'll get the same results. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was in the position of looking at best practices in a hospital developed somewhere else and trying them out in my place, I didn't get the same results as the folks who developed them claimed they got. They do work in some specific instances, but this one-size-fits-all approach to process improvement doesn't work because the vast majority of the problems on the previous slide don't fit this narrow set of criteria. If the process that you're trying to fix, putting in a central line in an intensive care unit, Doesn't vary very much from one ICU to another, from one part of the country to another, which it typically doesn't, then the one-size-fits-all best practice will get you a lot of the way there. If the causes of failure, the reasons why the process doesn't work, are relatively few and easy to identify, you'll get some traction. But none of the problems on the previous slide have any of those characteristics. They are much more complicated. So, oops, let's not do that. Complicated processes need more sophisticated problem-solving approaches. And what we've seen in all of those projects, in all those instances of complicated problems, is three very consistent findings. And the first one is that there aren't just 3 or 4 reasons why we're not doing a good job with hand hygiene. There are 15, 20, 25, 30 different causes of failure, each one of which usually requires a different intervention to get rid of. And I'll illustrate this for you in a second. And the real bottom line, punchline here, the thing that messes up this one-size-fits-all best practice, is that when you look at one place, whether it's a unit or a hospital, you look at one place and say, here are the 20 things that might be causing your hand hygiene problem. You don't find all 20. You find 4 or 5 that explain the majority of the failures. But the kicker is when you go to the next place and look at their causes, it's a different 4 or 5. So the same interventions, because each cause requires a different strategy, that worked at the first place to get rid of their 4 or 5 will not work as well in the second place because their causes are different. So the next generation of best practices will use problem-solving tools like these to produce interventions that are customized to the problems that you have where you're trying to do the improvement. So that's the theory, but let me show you the findings. So I said one of the first projects was hand hygiene. That was chosen when we polled, had a vote of all the participating hospitals, and we asked them, of all the problems that you have in safety and quality, which is the most important for you to solve for your own hospital? The problem that got the #1 votes was hand hygiene. Now, if you think about that for a minute, that's a very odd statement, isn't it? This is kind of a poster child of the seemingly simple process that we should always get right. We've known the data are pretty clear. These are some of the data. Monthly death rates from hospital-associated infection in one department, hand washing program here, the death rates plummet immediately. Is there anything wrong with these data? Well, they're a little old. They're from the 1840s. They're actually Semmelweis's original data from Vienna, where he showed it was a really good idea if you wash your hands. So why have we not solved this problem? And how big is the chasm in this area? Well, here, I think, are some of the answers. So I said, consistent findings, many causes, each cause requires a different intervention, and the key causes differ from one place to another. Here are just 5 of the top 20 causes of hand hygiene failure. If you don't have the hand gel dispensers in the right place, that's a big problem. If you don't have them full all the time, that's a big problem. But even if you have the hand gel dispensers in the right place and a nurse is coming to the door of that patient's room with their hands full of stuff to change a dressing, and there's no place to put it down, she's going to miss an opportunity to clean her hands. And even if you've got all of that straight, shelves and hand gel dispensers, if you've got a bad safety culture, and somebody is about to enter that patient's room, and 3 people are looking at that, and they're not all saying, "Stop, doctor, you can't go in there until you wash your hands," it doesn't matter how much hand gel you buy. So each one of these, please note, requires a very different strategy to get rid of. And here's the evidence, whoops, wrong button again. Here's the evidence for the third finding. The variation in key causes across hospitals. Each letter across the top is one hospital of the original 8. Each row is one cause, top 10 causes now. And an X means that cause was proven statistically to be an important cause of hand hygiene failure. Look at the variation in the causes. Let me point out one other thing. Suppose we had done this work and we had characterized, here are the top 10 causes of hand hygiene failure. Each one, here's the intervention to get rid of it. Here's your new best practice. Do all these 10 things and you'll solve your hand hygiene problem. Why would that be a bad idea? Well, one reason is if you look at Hospital A would be wasting its time in trying to use those that if each one requires is a separate intervention, 40% of the interventions would be wasted effort because they don't have the cause that intervention is aimed to get rid of. That's why experience with applying somebody else's best practice is usually less than satisfying. Because if you don't have the cause that their best practice was aimed at, you're wasting your time. So this approach turns out to be much more effective by targeting interventions to your critical causes and much more efficient by not wasting your time. Wrong site surgery. The simple one-size-fits-all best practice, the Joint Commission invented, the universal protocol, right? And it was wildly successful. Not so much. The best estimate today is that about 40 of these occur in the United States every week. Wrong site, wrong patient, wrong side surgical procedures. Now, I'm not going to go through, and all of that hand hygiene stuff, all of this wrong site surgery stuff is on the center's website. I'm not going to go through this in great detail. I'll point out one critical finding that was completely amazing to all of the hospitals that participated in this study, which should have been common sense, that we derived because we used these RPI tools. We were focused with the universal protocol on the very last time in the whole surgical process when you can stop this kind of event from happening, right? In the OR, right before the patient gets to the OR. What this project found is that there were many, many more risks for wrong site surgery in the whole surgical process, starting with the scheduling of the surgical procedure. 39% of cases had risks for wrong site surgery introduced at the time the procedure was scheduled. 52% had more risks in the peri-op area. 59% more risks in the operating room. And the risks varied across hospitals just like for hand hygiene. When they targeted, they reduced the risks by 50%. In some instances, for multiple risks, even more. And transitions, I'll go through this very quickly. 41% of communication across transitions were faulty, and the interventions reduced that to 17%. There were lots and lots of reasons, probably 35 different reasons. Many of them stemmed from the simple, again, why didn't we think of this before, aha moment. Every transition involves a sender and a receiver. Whether it's an ICU to a floor, whether it's a nursing home to a hospital, sender and receiver. In 10 hospitals and probably 50 different transitions, none of those organizations, 0, had any way of getting the senders and receivers to sit down together and discuss and agree, let alone measure, what a safe transition consisted of. Elementary, common sense. Prevalence, 0. Readmissions to hospitals decreased by 50%. 33% reduction in the time a patient waited in the emergency department after the decision to admit before they could get to a medical floor. And reduced readmissions to ICU after discharge. Lots of positive effects. This problem of failures of communication across transitions, handover communication, however you want to refer to it, is a critical quality problem. So the results are very consistent here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this in the interest of getting us close to back on time. The findings are very consistent, and the center is the only place that I know of where this kind of work is being done using these tools to generate the kind of learning that I've just summarized for you very quickly, and all of that is on the center's website. Now, let me close by telling you how the Joint Commission, and so far all of those hospitals on the participating hospital list are U.S. Organizations, because we have not found any organizations internationally, hospitals, that have mastered the RPI tools so that we can do these projects together on business timeframes. But we set for ourselves the task of delivering the knowledge from these projects to our accredited organizations, regardless of whether they knew anything about Lean or Six Sigma. And that is through the Targeted Solutions tool, which is now available only to US customers, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. We are connected to every US customer with a secure extranet connection. We're building that internationally. And this set of tools now is entirely web-based. It walks a hospital or any other organization through the process of measuring carefully, figuring out what your causes are, bringing those data back to a living, breathing database where you can see what interventions were used and proved to work on your causes and see how they work for you and bring those data back to the database to see how you're doing in improvement. And we've already talked about this. There are 3 groups of tools available now: hand hygiene, wrong site surgery, and handoff communication. Every set of learnings from the center will be put into the TST in order to disseminate. And let me show you some results. Hundreds of hospitals using hand hygiene over a year. The average performance was at 53%. That's just, did you wash when you went into a patient's room and when you came out of a patient's room? The average was a tick over 50%. 40% of the hospitals, because averages conceal a lot of variation, right? 40% of the hospitals were under 40%. They got to 77%, and these numbers are the actual numbers of observations that are in the database, highly statistically significant. It didn't seem to matter whether you're a nursing home, a critical care unit, emergency department, an ambulatory center. You got the same relative improvement in hand hygiene, and these numbers are getting better, higher as the organizations progress. The average is 77, but 20% of the hospitals and other organizations got to 90%, a real 90% hand hygiene compliance. What happens when you get to a real 90%? Well, this is from Cleveland Metro Health, a big hospital in Cleveland. They got to 95%, and their bloodstream infection rate fell by 2/3. 2/3. USA Today, 6 weeks ago or so, had a series of articles about C. difficile infection, a terrible infection for those often acquired in hospital for those non-clinicians. And they came to the conclusion, this is their editorial, curbing killer infections, C. diff infections, isn't rocket science. They asked me to write a companion opinion piece to this, and I actually agreed with them. It's not rocket science. It is much more difficult. I mean, rocket science is about getting machines to behave the way you want them to, right? Quality improvement in healthcare is about getting people to behave the way you want them to 99.99% of the time. So there is not a one-size-fits-all solution to this. What happens when you apply the lessons of RPI in the way that I've outlined? What happens to C. diff? Well, here's a hospital that went from 40 to 90% using the TST. Their C. diff rate dropped by 50%. MRSA, you have a problem with MRSA? Here's a hospital that went from 40 to 90, sustained 90 to 95%. Their MRSA rate dropped by 2/3 over the same time period. And let me finish up, I know I'm running a little late, by talking about the deployment of the TST internationally and an example of an organization that has used these tools to the max. We are now in the, I guess, middle stages, coming to the end of the pilot project, 8 countries, 9 different hospitals in all major JCI regions, to test whether the findings and all the tools inside the TST, the reasons for hand hygiene failure, the interventions, the training modules, all of the pieces, whether they work in different countries around the world. And they are in the process of using this. They've gotten some pretty good results. We think we're compiling all of those now. It was begun early this spring. And it's basically, as I said, to test the feasibility and applicability. And when we do that and when we're convinced, we'll make this much more widely available. And this was such an impressive accomplishment that we have an abstract accepted for presentation at the ISQA meeting later this month. Now, let me close with this story. Memorial Hermann is a 12-hospital system based in Houston, Texas. They are committed to this journey to high reliability, all the components of leadership, safety culture, etc. One of their hospitals, called Woodlands Hospital, was among the 8 original center hospitals in our hand hygiene project. And they were so impressed with the results from this one hospital that they committed 2 years ago to use the TST throughout their entire system to improve hand hygiene. Oops, I keep hitting the wrong button. Their baseline, despite the fact that they've been working on hand hygiene for a long time, in 150 inpatient units across these 12 hospitals was 44%. But averages conceal a lot of variation. One of their hospitals, the low end, was at 21% hand hygiene compliance. 21%. And we've seen that in the national use of the TST. Their aim was to exceed 90%, and that blue line shows you that by the end of June 2012, they were almost at 90% system-wide. All inpatient units, 12 hospitals. Here's what happened with one outcome: central line infections in the NICU. Going back to 2007, they had a pretty high and variable rate. They applied the one-size-fits-all best practice to getting rid of ICU central line infections, and they got a pretty good result. But then they applied the TST when there was a mean of about 2 per 1,000 line days. And what happened? They took that down almost by half. And look at the last 4 months of the control phase here: 0, 0, 0.5, 0.5, system-wide, all of their NICUs. This is ventilator-associated pneumonia, same story. They were way up here in 2006. The one-size-fits-all best practice got them a good result, but they applied the TST here when they were about at 1 per 1,000 ventilator days. They cut that in half and got to 0 ventilator-associated pneumonia in their entire system for the first time. 12 hospitals. They awarded Woodlands Hospital late last year, the hospital that was out front with this, an award, their Certified Zero Award, for 0 central line infections, not just in an ICU or 2, but in their entire hospital for 12 consecutive months. And here are the numbers. You can see that even after applying the one-size-fits-all best practice for central line and ventilator-associated pneumonia, they got an even 40% more reduction, getting to 0. The chief medical officer of this system said, "We fully attribute to the Center for Transforming Healthcare the final drop in HAI rates to 0 or near 0 system-wide." After implementing the CTH hand hygiene tools, our hospitals began to report zeros as their most common monthly central line-associated infection and ventilator-associated pneumonia result. Our hospitals reported 0 as their most common result for these infections. Our mothers were right after all. Now, my father used to tell me to wash my hands too. I don't know why he limited this to mothers. Feel free to quote me. This actually saves lives. So I will just conclude here by saying high reliability, consistent excellence is what we see the other side of that chasm looking like at the Joint Commission. All of our programs are aligned to help our customers, no matter where they are, just starting out, in the middle, getting better, wherever they are on this journey to high reliability. So I look forward to working with you, with your colleagues in Ireland, indeed around the world, to making that vision a reality.